And start. Welcome everyone to the Women in International Security Australia Meet the Expert series. I'm Maria Ross-Rubley. I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne, and I'm president of WIIS Australia. WIIS Australia is a registered charity put together to promote representation of women and gender diverse people, as well as promote analysis, intersectional gender analysis in international and national security in Australia. Before we do anything else, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. If you'd like, feel free to pop in the chat where you're dialing in from today. So this is part of our Meet the Expert series, and that's a chance to get to know senior women in international security in Australia, to hear about how they got into the field, what some of the challenges they've had, and their advice on how to survive and thrive. So the first 30 minutes we will record and put on our YouTube channel, and the last 30 minutes are sort of it's not recorded, so we can just have a frank discussion. And we do develop a short blog post for our website, which Susan will approve. It won't have any names, but basically to share some of the tips and tricks. So now let me turn over to introducing our expert today. We're so delighted to have Susan Coles, former ambassador and DFAT official with 30 years of experience in diplomacy and international relations. She's a member of our WIIS Australia Advisory Board, and we have other members here. I see former Ambassador Jane Marie Hardy, who also was a speaker at our Meet the Expert series previously this year. So I'm going to post our link to Susan's bio in the chat. So you can read through that. I don't want to talk too much about her bio because she's going to tell us about our background. But I do want to say, Susan is known for her extremely generous time that she's given to talk about international relations, about careers and diplomacy at Monash, at the University of Melbourne, at La Trobe, at Deakin, and other places. I mean, people know Susan for not just her outstanding work in the field, but how she has given back so much to the younger generation. So Susan, thank you for joining us and being willing to share that again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I have a few questions for Susan to get us started. Can you tell us about your academic background? And I also want to put you in our spotlight here, and how you ended up in a career in diplomacy and international relations.
Sure. Well, thank you again for the invitation. And I'm also hailing from Nam, Wurundjeri country. So yes, I studied history and international politics, law and French in my undergraduate studies at university. And I thought at that time that I might pursue a career in diplomacy or international affairs, although I did also love law. I was fortunate enough to win a Rhodes Scholarship, and at Oxford I discovered international law and human rights law, and that's when my path became a bit clearer. I secured then after Oxford a stage or internship at the European Union in Brussels, immediately after Oxford. And then I also spent a summer interning at the UN Human Rights Centre in Geneva as part of the UN Centre in Geneva. And while at that time I really did want to work, I decided I wanted to work for the UN. I then had to spend some time back in Adelaide with family. I'd been away for a few years, but everything happens for a reason. And there I got a job just teaching at my old university, Adelaide. And one of my favourite colleagues there at Adelaide Law School was the wonderful Hilary Charlesworth, who became a mentor and further inspired me in the direction of international law. As I'm sure many of you will know, she's now Australia's judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So she's had an amazing career and been a wonderful mentor to me. So at that point, I did see an advertisement in the newspaper back in the day. That's how one often got a job. It was that long ago, for a UN, what was called a UN Junior Professional Officer or JPO position, which was a 2-year position. And I thought, this is it, my dream entry point to the UN system. And I heard nothing for a year, but then got a phone call and was asked to start training in New York within a week. So headed over there and then was posted as a junior professional officer to Malaysia. But again, fate had other plans. The program was meant to be 2 years, and halfway through my 2-year contract, it was an AusAid, or now DFAT funded program, and in fact, someone back in Canberra decided to cut the program, leaving me high and dry, unemployed in Malaysia, with no plan. But fortunately, by that stage, I'd met the DFAT team at the Australian High Commission, which included the lovely Jane Hardy, who's on the call, now former Ambassador Jane Hardy, but who was then a first secretary at the High Commission. And the other colleagues encouraged me, said, well, with international law and some UN experience, you could apply for a job in DFAT. And of course, everyone knows about the graduate program, but that DFAT also hires people laterally as specialists. So I applied for a legal specialist job and did an interview over the telephone. This is the days before Zoom, telephone interview, and then got a job as a lawyer, joining the DFAT legal office at that point. That was in 1995. And as a specialist, you're recruited to do the specialist role. So I needed to remain as a lawyer working in the legal division for the first few years, which I did, and worked on quite a number of UN negotiations, including some in the security space and international law space. And then my first overseas posting with DFAT was very squarely in the security space. It was to go to the UN, permanent mission to the UN in Vienna, where I focused on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and matters at the International Atomic Energy Agency. And at that time, the IAEA weapons inspectors were soon to hit the headlines, searching for the Bush-Blair weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So it was certainly a very interesting time to be there. So I was focusing on some of those issues, and also as Australia's representative at what's called the CTBT organisation, which Australia was long involved through the negotiations and then the establishment of the CTBT. So working on nuclear issues on my first posting. So yeah, that's how I ended up in DFAT and developing a bit of an interest in that security space.
Wonderful. Wow, that's really something, and I think, some people might have been discouraged by, suddenly you're in this amazing program and it just is cut. But you
Mm.
picked yourself up and said, "Yep, I'm going to keep going." And I'm glad you did, because we would have lost a lot if you hadn't. So,
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'm happy to say that program, after me lamenting its demise for some 21 years or so, was finally restored. I think in Canberra they realised actually it is a good thing to get young Australians into the UN system who can then work their way up or bring those skills back to Australia. So good on DFAT. They've now refunded that program, and it's open to not just anyone applying from within DFAT, but across the Commonwealth Public Service. So that's a great opportunity for young public servants to go and then bring that experience back, or who knows, maybe they end up within the UN system.
wow, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear it.
Mm.
I was wondering, were there any pivotal projects or initiatives that you worked on early in your career that helped you establish your professional reputation and sort of the angle which you were moving toward?
Yes, I would. I had to think about that question. It's a great question. And I suppose those first 5 years in the legal office, I did a lot of international legal negotiation, a lot of drafting, preparing Australia's position for treaty negotiations, but also within, the Australian domestic policy context, was involved with a range of quite, security and defence related issues. And one example that I thought about was as acting director then of our international law section in the legal office, there were quite a lot of issues in the late 90s to be resolved around Australia's involvement in the UN peacekeeping efforts in East Timor. And when Australian military or civilian police personnel, for example, deploy as part of an international peacekeeping mission or a UN assistance mission, we have to negotiate the rules of engagement that will apply for our troops in the field, working, in that situation, working alongside troops from other countries. So that's quite a complex endeavour to prepare those rules before we can get the sign off for our troops to go into that situation. So together with lawyers from the Attorney General's Department's Office of International Law and Defence legal specialists, I was responsible for developing these rules of engagement, and they had to, of course, conform to the relevant Security Council resolution, which authorised a multinational peacekeeping force to go into East Timor. And our involvement there actually lasted from 1999 through to the end of 2012 and was instrumental in East Timor gaining independence. So the International Force for East Timor, or INTERFET as it was known, that force deployed from 1999 to 2000, and then we had subsequent efforts to continue the peace after that, and that remains Australia's largest peacekeeping mission to date and our largest overseas military deployment since Vietnam. And it was also the first time that Australia was leading that international coalition. So that was definitely a key learning experience for me, working in partnership with much more senior defence and Attorney Generals, lawyers, becoming known to them and getting to know them and their perspectives, answering questions from our Minister's office when required, their Minister's office, and just working out both the international law aspects of that, but also our Australian military law elements. So, I would say that was one of those early seminal experiences within DFAT and the international law.
Wow, that is super interesting. I mean, did you find that there was pushback from places within Australia over, I mean, certainly there's tension between, what the UN Security Council resolutions, might direct us toward, and then how our own internal bureaucratic operating procedures might push us.
Yeah, it's definitely, and I suppose that was all part of just sort of finding out, what our domestic perspective was. Also, the usual rules of engagement that apply in a military deployment, which is not a peacekeeping mission, but rather is defensive, or happily during my lifetime, but not since Vietnam, there hasn't been an intervention. Uh, you know, Certainly not in our region anyway, of more of that nature. But yes, just understanding the whole Security Council piece, and then how we fit within that, and alongside, as I say, we were one of 22 nations with forces participating in that, and we also had civilian police personnel as well, so that added another interesting dimension. But it was good to get to know those, as I say, the Office of International Law within, I suppose, the international law firmament. DFAT plays a very important role, but particularly as a junior officer in DFAT, the oil senior lawyers were like the gods, Bill Campbell and Rosalie Balkan, names very well known in their time, are coming over for a meeting, and Mike Kelly from Defence, who went on to become a member of Parliament, actually, very expert defence lawyer. Certainly, very, very high level and expert, and a wonderful opportunity just to work with them.
Fantastic. I mean, along those lines, I mean, what do you think, what does a typical day look like at DFAT? And I can imagine that would depend dramatically, if you're stationed, if you were high commissioner somewhere, or, in the office. But if somebody was wondering what the day-to-day life looked like, how would you respond?
Sure. Well, yes, it certainly does depend a lot on where you are, whether you're overseas, and if so, in what type of mission we call it, or whether you're in Canberra at headquarters. Overseas, I mentioned my time at the UN in Vienna. They can be very long working days, because very often you need to go into the mission, the embassy, first thing in the morning, like early, to get overnight instructions, which would potentially be sent by a confidential cable from Canberra. If you're going to a UN meeting or negotiation, that day or that week. So you'll go in, potentially meet, the ambassador if you're a more junior officer, get those instructions, then get yourself out to the UN. In Vienna, it was a half-hour train ride out to the UN headquarters, where you would then potentially attend the meeting negotiation from 10 in the morning till often 6 in the evening. And then, depending on whether you had a function to go to, there might be a cocktail reception if it was the start of the week, start of a long negotiation, welcoming all the delegates. So you rush to the function from 6 till 7, and then quite often back to the embassy, the mission, to send an update of what had happened during the day. That would depend if it's a fast-moving negotiation. Sometimes these negotiations go on for 5 weeks, in which case you don't have to send a message back each night. But particularly if a decision was going to be required or a change in negotiating position, back to the mission to send a message back. So one of the questions I'm often asked in this sort of context is, what are the challenges of this sort of working life? And it's the work-life balance for some of these assignments. You will spend a lot of time, either at the office or at the UN, and not so much time at home with the family. So that can be a challenge, or partner. But that's the life on posting. It's exciting. It's adrenaline fueled very often. You'll sometimes have a delegation or even a minister flying in from Canberra who's going to negotiate those last stages of the deal, or participate at the UN in New York, for example. And back in Canberra, it can be very often just like any other office job or public service job. You go to work in the morning, read the cables that have come in from posts where you're working on the issues overnight, read the news clippings, see what the hot issues are affecting your patch of work, and then, sometimes have to get instructions from up the line, or the minister's office, and then send out new instructions. That's if you're in perhaps a UN or a negotiating area. But again, you might be working in a very different space, a bilateral space. Ambassador Hardy, who's on the call, for example, her most recent role was as head of the Europe branch within the Europe division, covering a ridiculous number of countries. I think it was something like 40 countries were in her patch. So there would be requests and issues and planned visits and things going on in any number of those countries, or perhaps something at the European Union headquarters in Brussels that her and her team, or my team and myself would be working on back in Canberra. And then we have the state offices as well, where I spent some time in Melbourne. That's when I first got to know some of the Melbourne people on this call. And the state offices do what we call domestic diplomacy. So that could be dealing with universities, business headquarters that are based in, say, Melbourne or Sydney, hosting a visit from a foreign delegation, particularly maybe a trade or commercial delegation. If that delegation was visiting Melbourne, planning a visit out to CSIRO and universities, hydrogen project in Victoria to show off Australia's technology, and everything from the logistics and where that delegation would have lunch, to the bus, to the cars, to the briefing for example, sometimes our minister would host, or a deputy minister might host that visit. So that office would be preparing that program, welcoming the delegation, maybe organising to take them to a cultural event in the evening. So a very wide variety of tasks, as I say, and days in the office, depending whether you're overseas, in headquarters Canberra, or perhaps in a state office.
Okay. I don't know about anyone else, but I feel exhausted just hearing all of that. I mean,
I'm thinking, thank goodness I've retired. Whew, now I can relax. It can be
so
very
I so that sounds like the work-life balance is a huge challenge, especially for women in the role. I mean, how did you handle those challenges?
Wow, yes. It's there's no doubt it can be challenging. I was lucky, I suppose, in that in Vienna it was pre-children, so I had a spouse, and to be honest, it was a bit challenging for him, because I was often, he didn't know anyone in Vienna, he didn't speak German, he didn't have a job to go to every day. He was back at the apartment. he was writing a PhD, so he had something to work on. But that was a bit lonely, for a partner or a spouse, and that can be an issue. We then had our first child, daughter, at the end of that posting. And I do remember rushing home from the UN to breastfeed, rushing back to the meetings, expressing in the coffee room. And that can be a very challenging balance, particularly those busy postings. But at the same time, you sometimes in those postings you have help, home help. You can afford home help that you wouldn't have, in Australia, where the costs of something like that can be prohibitive. So that can really be a great help, particularly in the Asian region. And but there's no doubt that it is a juggle. And in terms of it taking quite a while for women to reach senior levels, and especially to have the opportunity for those ambassadorial postings, there was often a sense that, women couldn't possibly do this because they have their family responsibilities, and it took a long time to bring about cultural change, and that came, partly through anti-discrimination legislation and equal opportunity legislation, which we benefit from in Australia. But also then I think the department surveying the staff, what are the barriers, what challenges are women facing, and things like supportive policies on childcare, getting our own childcare centre within DFAT, which was a wonderful innovation and really helped work-life balance back in Canberra. And having progressive secretaries, starting with Peter Varghese and then continued by Frances Adamson, who was our first ambassador to China, but also had 4 children herself, and just being an awareness of those challenges and how to balance. But I guess in my case, I've also had a very supportive partner who is an academic and whose work has been a bit flexible in terms of being able to take leave without pay or spend 3 years offshore focusing on his research. But if one has, for example, a spouse who's a GP or a barrister or something like that, that's very hard to then take that person with you on posting or bring the family with you on posting. So they're all some of the challenges that you navigate and go into with a diplomatic career with your eyes open, knowing that there will be those challenges. But the department works hard to try to have in place supportive policies, accord with all the legislation, and try to support families alongside their posted spouse.
Great. So I've done some research on women's representation in national security in Australia. And, among DFAT, Defence, Home Affairs, Australian Federal Police, DFAT is certainly the best in terms of
Really?
representation.
Oh,
Well, among those agencies.
yeah. I
But
shouldn't
of
be
course,
surprised.
research does show that, it is still hard for women, especially in more senior capacities,
Mhm.
and that a lot of women tend to be, shepherded into like HR and more sort of executive functions rather than in the analytical and substantive roles. So, certainly hearing some of the challenges faced, that makes sense why. So,
Mm, mm. Yeah, and I mean, when we get to the Q&A or at any point, Ambassador Hardy may want to comment as well. But yes, I think we've been fortunate. I think also having women ministers sort of gave things a push along from Julie Bishop, and she was very passionate about women's empowerment, both amongst the DFAT, but also in our policy and our activities, especially in the development space and so on. But yes, I think having women ambassadors, leaders, there's no doubt that they are certainly role models then for the rest of and a woman secretary, a woman minister. It's all great role models for women in the organisation, and getting out of those cul-de-sacs of HR and maybe public and cultural diplomacy and into the harder edged positions, including those embassies of Indonesia, China. I don't think we've had a woman ambassador in Washington yet, but they tend to be ex-politicians. But yeah, certainly having our first woman ambassador to China, and now Indonesia. I mean, those are barriers and glass ceilings, if you like, that really demonstrate. And we do, I wanted to mention to our ambassador to the UN in Geneva now, which is responsible for disarmament. We have a woman, and we also have a woman serving as our we have like a roving ambassador for arms control and counter proliferation, and she is a female colleague. So they are great role models. Also out there in those fora, they might be, in the minority in those meeting rooms in Geneva, the Security Council, the CTBT can still feel quite like a boys' club in terms of representation from the other countries. But there's no doubt that the Australian women and often the Canadians and the Nordics and so on who have women there are, breaking down those barriers and being role models and just saying to the boys, we're here too, and negotiating just as hard as they do on those hard-edged issues. I think Australia can be quite proud of our record in that regard.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, and I mean, it makes me think there's actually, so WIIS Australia members have actually done a lot of research on this in this area. I mean, I think
Mm,
Elise Stevenson just published a book on this, and I know Beck Stratting has done work on women's representation in international relations, and Shannon's done research in this area, and others, I'm sure. So I think what we need to do is we need to compile a list on
mm,
our
mm.
website and put it up. So I
Yeah.
think so. I'm going to turn off the recording now. So thank you everyone for joining us on the YouTube channel. And we're going to turn now to a sort of frank, open Q&A. So let me stop.